Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
For any new listeners that are not familiar with the podcast, usually we just kind of get into this, but when we first started the podcast, if you remember this, Adam, we would kind of explain like, hey, this is the purpose of the podcast and this is what we talk about. And we haven't done that. So if you are new to the Adversary Universe podcast, we cover... welcome for one, exactly. And we cover essentially, what the bad guys are doing, right? From a cyber perspective, from eCrime groups to hacktivist groups to the nation state groups that you read about so often in your X feed or your Instagram feed or whatever feeds that you're getting your media and your updates from. We talk about intelligence that Adam Myers has basically developed here at CrowdStrike since...
Well, not me, the team.
Well, Adam Myers and his team. That's a really good point. We got to give credit where credit is
due.
The
team gets all the credit. I just had the idea.
Exactly. But still, right? This the objective of this podcast is to educate you and inform you and keep you, abreast of what type of tradecraft we're observing. And then we welcome your feedback and your questions if we haven't clarified something during one of these sessions. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for subscribing, and feel free to send this to your relatives so you can talk about
Smash that like button.
Smash that like button. And this is all good conversational pieces, right?
It is, yeah. I think this is a good conversation. Stay away from politics and talk about cyber.
Politics, exactly. Talk about cyber and talk about law enforcement, right? How law enforcement is getting involved. Because this episode is actually about a recent report that we published that actually focuses on trends in law enforcement getting involved with a lot of the cyber campaigns that your team has been tracking. And the report that I've read so far, I think it's fascinating because you and I have spoken about this before, getting more guests that have been tied to law enforcement. I'm a very big fan of also even understanding the physical side of the house, right? Like our adversary is actually physically getting into locations. Is it, there's tons of shows out there that have highlighted hacking, and I think in a poor fashion, right? Where you see an episode of whatever and someone's smashing on the keyboard and they're like, I just hacked the firewall, I'm in, right? And clearly that's not the case.
Christian, I don't know if you saw that there was a statement about Endgame, which is an operation that's been going on now for a little bit, spearheaded by law enforcement in Europe. Europol has kind of driven a lot of it. And what they're actually doing is they've kind of looked at how can we disrupt the broader ecosystem of these threats, right? When you think about ransomware, that's kind of the late stage of what happens, right? When the ransomware gets deployed and the files get encrypted. But there's a lot of things that happen on the front end of that. Most of the adversaries, as we've talked about on this podcast before, have moved towards identity attacks. And we're seeing a lot more threat actors kind of focusing on voice-based phishing or social engineering or things like that. And that a lot of those stolen identities are driven by this broader ecosystem of info stealers and things like that enable, or malware as a service, or things like that kind of drive, the kind of early stages of what will later become ransomware. And Endgame sought to disrupt that. So they were disrupting things like Luma Stealer and some of the info stealers. And that is, I think, a really useful tactic for law enforcement to take, because as you start to raise the cost across the board for the adversary, you start to make things more difficult for them. They need to think twice before they do certain things. Their infrastructure, they have to stand it back up after it gets disrupted. So things like Endgame are, I think, moving the needle in the right direction in terms of adversary disruption.
Yeah, and for those of you not familiar with the Endgame program, right, that operation involved law enforcement agencies from 6 EU countries, Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US, with collaboration from Europol, and I think over 30 private partners in the cybersecurity industry. And that was actually...
Including CrowdStrike.
Including CrowdStrike, actually, really good point to underscore. And that operation was headquartered out of the Netherlands in Den Haag, or The Hague, right? See, I threw my Dutch in there, by the way. And so... That. You heard that, right?
It's a party trick.
It is. It is a party trick. And so the raids resulted in over 1,000 servers that were taken down or disrupted worldwide. There was 20 domains that were seized, 11 locations one in Germany, one in Greece, 9 in the Netherlands itself. There was an arrest that was made, I believe, right, of a suspected operator of venom
I
rat.
think a few, yeah.
And sort of a couple of them. And so these are operations that, in this very coordinated effort, are disrupting adversary behavior and taking down malware families and botnets. So I think this is really important. I would love for you to give a little feedback on. There have been other versions of this in the past, though, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, and we're talking about this report that we released to our Intel customers, which covers disruptions from 2014 through today. And so, as law enforcement has kind of really been engaging with an adversary, doesn't rest on their laurels. They're constantly finding new ways to innovate, new techniques, new tactics, new tools. And law enforcement is doing the same thing, right? And so we've seen disruptions that, and as malware has changed, those disruptions by nature have had to change. So if you think about some of the earlier ones, one that comes to mind for me is the disruption of Game Over Zeus, which was targeting a fairly prevalent malware at the time, Game Over Zeus, which was used for stealing credentials. And the goal of that was to do wire fraud, account transfers, and things like that. And then the secondary target, if they couldn't find an ACH that they could go after, account clearinghouse, they would go after individual accounts for credit cards and bank cards and things like that. And then really the last piece that they would do to try to monetize those infected hosts was to do an early version of ransomware, CryptoLocker.
Yeah.
And so, that really kind of set the pace for where things were going to go. And I think it was in 14 or 15 was the Game Over Zeus disruption. I remember it was, I think, June 2015, if I remember correctly, or May. And that was targeting Game Over Zeus, which operated as a peer-to-peer botnet. So peer-to-peer botnets were very popular at that time period because they were resilient, because they were able to use that peer-to-peer infrastructure to avoid disruption, to avoid being taken down. And a number of researchers, including some who worked at CrowdStrike at the time, supported law enforcement in finding a flaw in the peer-to-peer protocol and were able to use that to effectively disrupt that botnet from a technical perspective. And that was paired with putting Evgeny Bogachev, who is the proprietor of that botnet, the main proprietor, put him on the FBI's top 10 cyber most wanted list. And ultimately there were sanctions and things like that. So they kind of brought a lot of the tools to the table that they then used to frame many of the follow-on operations of trying to disrupt the adversary financially, personally, and then to also technically disrupt the botnet.
That's interesting. In our report that you published, or your team published, you kind of highlight these trends or these key points of the financial disruption through those sanctions. It basically leads to these asset seizures and basically full OPSEC methods to disable all of the infrastructure that these groups have access to. But there's one interesting point where you're talking about how quickly these eCrime ecosystems generate replacement services, right? So where they're almost like turning on the light and then the roaches are scattering, right? And so they're basically joining new groups. And so it's not necessarily you're disrupting these operations, but the bad guys aren't going away by any means, right?
Well, as long as there's money to be made, they're going to keep doing bad guy stuff.
Exactly.
But I think the more that you force them to have to adjust fire and change what they're doing, it slows them down, right? And it maybe makes it a little bit more difficult for them. Now, with ransomware as a service, there's so many ransomware as a services out there that if one group gets disrupted, the users, right, the affiliates of that ransomware as a service, they can find other ransomware to use. So that's kind of one of the things that you have to look out for is if you're going to do a disruption, a lot of planning goes into that because you want to understand what are they going to do in response to this. So you go through the planning phase, you try to account for all of that, and then the adversary is going to do different things that maybe weren't expected. A good example of that was there's Indrix Spider, which used Dridex and Bitpaymer for ransomware operations, and they went through various iterations of the tools that they were using, and at one point they actually sanctioned and put the actual malware, evil core, and some of the operators like Maxim Yakubits on the OFAC list. So they were effectively telling the victims, and this was, I think they only really did this once, and they realized that it didn't work, was, they put these named entities on the OFAC list, and what they effectively did was just rebrand, right? Because they realized that they could change the name of the malware, avoid the OFAC sanction, because if you're a victim, you get hit by that ransomware, and you work with your outside counsel, and you work with all of these incident response organizations, and different people come help you. Yeah. But one of the things that happens is they get to a point where they're making a decision of, do we pay or do we not pay? And outside counsel, if it's something that is on the OFAC named entities list, is going to advise their customer, you can't pay this because you're going to violate OFAC, and then you're going to have to pay the government, right? So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place with that. And so the threat actors just changed their name, and then they're not on the OFAC list, and so you can still effectively pay that. So that was kind of one of the experiments that we've seen the government, and I say it's not just law enforcement, but it's also the prosecutors and others that are involved, kind of were like, hey, let's try this and see what happens. And when they realized that they couldn't keep pace, I think they recognized that wasn't an effective way to disrupt or try to impact these guys.
Interesting. And so the shift has been really, or the focus rather, has really shifted now to the adversary themselves or the individuals, right? Because I've seen there have been sanctions applied to like the names of some of these eCrime groups. There have been some indictments that have been made public. There's been some arrests, as you mentioned. So how much does that act as a deterrent in the grand scheme of these groups?
Well, the individuals are kind of an interesting story, right? Because especially with the conflict in Ukraine, there was a lot of people that left Russia that didn't want to get drafted into military service. There was a lot of people that left other countries as a result. And so those individuals now moving throughout the world maybe go places that they're less protected than they are in the Russian Federation. So there's been some effect of geopolitics that has kind of, given, put some of these people in motion that would have not been in motion before.
Interesting.
A good example of where that happens, we've talked about this before, but the Helios takedown, where Peter Levashov, who, AKA Peter Severa, AKA Peter North, he was on vacation with his family in Spain, and there was a disruption in, I think it was 2017, of Helios, where there was a technical disruption, and we actually put analysts on the ground with law enforcement to help accomplish the technical disruption of that botnet, but they also arrested him while he was on vacation.
Oh, wow.
So that's kind of, the best case scenario is that you are able to get hands on the threat actor and take them off the field at the same time you disrupt their botnet, because that effectively limits their ability to operate.
To operate, exactly. Or expand or try to, escape or find some type of backup mechanism, right?
Exactly.
To redistribute. That's
Yeah.
very interesting. You also mentioned in this report, or your team mentions in this report, especially along the lines of seizures and takedowns, DLSs, right? Or dedicated leak sites, for those of you not familiar with the term. Also, one thing we want also, as we use more acronyms, I want to make sure that we define those for our listeners that are not familiar with things like what a DLS is. And so how does law enforcement get access to these DLSs? Are we talking about working with web hosting providers or infrastructure as a service companies? What does that look like?
Well, a lot of them are hosted on like Tor hidden services or bulletproof hosts or things that are going to be resistant to law enforcement takedown.
Yep.
I think Operation Endgame is a good example where they got into the adversary's psychology as well. And, there was I think in Endgame 2, there's been kind of 3 phases of Endgame. In Endgame 2, I think it was, they took over the dedicated leak site of one of those ransomware groups, and they started kind of taunting them and putting a countdown timer, kind of playing back what they do to the victim to the threat actor.
Oh, wow.
And basically saying like, hey, like we're going to leak a bunch more information about you in the next 4 days. And there's like a countdown timer. And so that puts the adversary into a panic, because they're like, what do they know? What did they get into? And even if they have the resiliency to bring the DLS back up someplace else or reconstitute their operations, there's this kind of ticking time bomb that they're all freaking out about. And maybe some of those threat actors decide like, hey, before this goes bad, I'm going to reach out to law enforcement. I'm going to help them so that I can avoid prosecution.
Oh, wow.
So there's a whole psychological impact to some of these takedown operations. It's pretty cool.
So the snitches come out, huh?
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
You know, like you said, the lights come on, and it's almost like musical chairs, right? Like the guy without the chair is going to be like, you know what? Actually, let me help you.
Let me go help the DJ.
Yeah, exactly.
That's hysterical. Wow, that's fascinating. Can you share a little more on CrowdStrike's role in this operation and even our history? You mentioned a really good example of us, tapping into that botnet. But like with this specific operation, like how did we assist? Did you share
Intel support, giving them, what we know about the threat actors, what their tools look like, how they operate. All of those give law enforcement. If they didn't already know it, it helps give them the confidence to know that, hey, if we disrupt, because when you plan a disruption, there's a lot that goes into that. And so it gives them the confidence and it gives them a little bit of the technical visibility to understand if we do this, you kind of have to play that game. It's like if we disrupt over here, what will they do? Mm-hmm. And if they do that, like what counters, because you don't want to make it worse, right? Exactly. Which you could, right? Yeah. So you don't want to, if there's a technical issue with a botnet and you disrupt it and you're not successful in completely disrupting it, then the adversary is going to learn from that. And they're going to fix the issue. Yeah. And I think we saw that with Kelios. Kelios had a number of takedowns. In fact, we did one live on stage at RSA back in, I think it was 2012 or 2013 or somewhere around there, where we actually got on stage and disrupted Kelios, and you could actually see all the infected hosts dropping in real time and getting sinkholed by our sinkhole. And so that showcased, hey, like, look at this, it's a cool takedown. But they were back online probably, by the end of the day, if not, that week. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't as effective as a comprehensive takedown, and the adversary figured out that there was an issue with their peer-to-peer infrastructure that they fixed. So you have to be very careful when you plan one of these disruptions because you don't want to give the adversary a new advantage that you're not prepared to deal with.
Yeah, you don't want to show them your hand, right?
And what we've seen in this report, and getting into some of the key points of the report, was that the technical takedown, they're resulting in increasingly shorter periods of disruption because the adversaries have figured out how to be more resilient to these disruptions. So you do a disruption and they're back online faster and faster each time. So, you need to be very thoughtful about how you do this.
I think this is fascinating. Could you share a little bit on like what has law enforcement and private sector collaboration been? What does it look like over the past decade? I mean, it seems that this is becoming a lot more prevalent, right? Before, you didn't necessarily hear a lot about, company X working with law enforcement, or you would have a company say, "Hey, I just had correspondence from the FBI, and they said they found these IOCs that were tied to, something phoning out of our infrastructure. Now they're coming to the private sector for help." Like, what does that look like now? Right? Are we seeing a lot more collaboration? Is it tighter? Is it the same? What could there be improvements?
I think Endgame is a great example, right? You get some of the law enforcement folks, particularly Europol, has reached out to the private sector, and they're like, "Hey, we're planning a comprehensive operation against this target, right? That target could be an info stealer, it could be ransomware, whatever it is." And then they bring all the people that have parts of the information, help bring everybody together, and then everybody's working off the same sheet of music. Yeah. And so that is an enduring operation. Endgame is in phase 3 right now. So that is, or just completed phase 3. So that is an example of kind of an enduring operation meant to continue to keep the pressure on the adversary. And that, I think, is ultimately the right move, and what we need to be doing is that we need to be increasing the pace of these disruptions because the adversaries are coming back online faster. Yeah. But we've already seen that some of these disruptions have changed the way that adversaries operate. So, back in 2015, 2016, 2017, we saw these really kind of hierarchical organizations of threat actors that were, effectively top down. And we see that in some of the Conti leaks, which is tied to TrickBot, which we track as Wizard Spider. And so you see that when that happens, they fracture and they go off to different groups. And I think now what they've kind of been doing is they've really been more decentralized, because they recognize that hierarchical organizations are bigger targets. So when there's a law enforcement disruption, some of those or forum disruption, because that's part of the ecosystem, that the members jump someplace else more quickly. Yeah. And they've created smaller decentralized groups. So if you cut off the head, there's another one that grows back. It's not unlike what we've seen from, terrorists, right? Where terrorists were very centralized structures, and then they moved to decentralized structures to avoid, if you take out one cell of a terror group, that there's other cells that are operating independent, and you can't kind of, you think about, I don't know, maybe if you ever saw the show The Wire, right, where they're doing drug busts in Baltimore, and they do this kind of approach of, you target the street level dealer, and then you get them to give you information. You keep working your way up, right? I think they call it like buy bust or something like that. And that is one approach that I think has worked with those hierarchical organizations, but because they've become decentralized, that doesn't work as well. And so now you have to kind of look at each cluster of activity and figure out what's the maximum amount of pain you can inflict to disrupt what they're doing, and try to either cause them to go to another group or cause them to have to, sit back and figure out what's going on. And we've seen in some cases like Alpha Spider, which was responsible for Alpha V and things like that, that when there was a disruption there, they pulled an exit scam, because they were like, this isn't worth it. And they ended up ripping off a couple of their customers, I think one for like tens of millions of dollars. And then they kind of went dark. So the more that you can kind of do that and force them to take those types of missteps, they malign their customer base, and then there's less trust, right? So the more that you can kind of cause these threat actors to not trust each other, that adds additional friction, and that's ultimately helpful from a disruption perspective.
Yeah, and I'm sure like the lack of trust, we're talking about big money here, right? I know that in our report we highlight some of the financial scale of some of these operations. I know tied to the Operation Kronos, the Department of Justice highlighted the financial scale of Bitwise Spider's operations, and some of the findings in this report they're massive, right? So their ransomware as a service platform had received over $500 million in ransom payments, which I think is a fascinating number. And Khrushchev, who was actually part of the indictment that was issued by the DOJ, he had received individually, it looks like, over $100 million in Bitcoin, right? Based upon his 20% fee from that RAS service. So this is big money we're talking about, right? Which it obviously warrants the need for, I think, this collaborative effort from law enforcement and private companies. But that's just one group we're talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, so, there's big money in this, which is why they keep doing it, right? If it was, the more difficult it is for them to make money, the more they're going to find an easier way to make money.
I think it would be fascinating to also have like an economist on the show to highlight things like socioeconomic issues in different parts of the world that can be correlated directly to an increase in eCrime activity, right?
Yeah,
so I think that would be fascinating.
Well, and to that end, I think we've seen, and we have a whole team that focuses on this, but tracking cryptocurrency, because cryptocurrency is the currency of eCrime. It's not not centralized. It's easy to find ways to get around things like know your customer and various controls that have been put in place. And so tracking, you got to follow the money, right? That goes back to the earliest days of criminal investigation, is follow the money. Yeah. And so that's kind of, what we've been seeing. But, I think the original approach and a lot of the investigative tools that we were using in the earlier days kind of looked at it almost like an organized crime situation, and, trying to figure out how do you maybe build like almost like a RICO case around some of these eCrime activities. But now what we're seeing is that this stuff has become decentralized. So it's hard to get, an indictment and a disruption against a corrupt organization or an eCrime syndicate when it doesn't exist,
Yeah.
right? Which is I think the result of some of the earlier disruptions caused them to move to that less centralized approach.
Got it. Do you foresee public and private collaboration, increasing because of how successful this operation was in the grand scheme of things?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think, we've got great partners in law enforcement, and law enforcement's, what we're really seeing now, the early benefit of having true cyber agents, right? True cyber investigators, because in the early days, it was people that, went into the FBI that had backgrounds in accounting, or, we're kind of more focused on white collar crime, or things like that. And so having the law enforcement personnel that understand what happens in the ecosystem and how these tools work and how to do a cyber investigation, we've come up with, collaboratively more innovative approaches to disruption. And I think we've been seeing the value of that. And now, I would argue that the next step is to ratchet that up, to keep the pressure on and to do more and more of these large-scale disruptions like Kronos and Endgame, and use that to really applies maximum pressure to these threat actors.
I think we should also talk to the likes of Sean Henry, right?
He was the executive assistant director
at FBI. And so would love to have Sean Henry's feedback on how he sees law enforcement getting more involved with collaboration with private sector, and also maybe even some trends that he's observing on how eCrime groups are responding to this type of enforcement and law enforcement takedowns. So
yeah, and he's always fun to talk to. Yeah, and when you think about, talking about something like Endgame, which has had various phases. It started off targeting what we call bitwise spider, which is Lockbit, was kind of phase one of Endgame, and then phase two was looking at other pieces of the puzzle, and then obviously phase three looking at more of the broader infrastructure. So, but if you look at how law enforcement's really been using these tools, it's gotten more effective over time, and it's in thanks to some of those agents that truly are trailblazers. The National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance has been around for probably close to 20 years now, and what the NCFTA did was they kind of took academia. They had all of these researchers that were able to go into the underground forums and to collect information, students effectively that were doing this work, and they were getting funding and resources from the private sector, who were trying to, financial services and tech companies that were like, hey, this is a problem. We don't have the resources or the focus to disrupt this, but the NCFTA does. So they started giving resources to it. And then also law enforcement. So the FBI created something called CERFU, the Cyber Initiative Resource Fusion Unit, which is headquartered out of the NCFTA. And so then you have law enforcement sitting there with the researchers and industry, sharing information in real time, and then using that to launch some of these investigations and disruptions.
I love this. We're going to put those links in the show notes as well, just to give our listeners or whoever's using your podcast app of choice a link to the NCFTA and also CERFU, because I think these are really fantastic resources on how we're collaborating on disrupting cybercrime as much as possible, right? So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think FBI is very bullish on this here in the U.S. and of course, NCA in the UK and Europol. They're out there, truly doing God's work here in disrupting these threats, and they need all the resources and help they can.
Yeah, I think this also highlights and underscores why it's so important to have a lot of the data that we're publishing on the adversary. So knowing the adversary, understanding their tradecraft, their motivation, their intentions, where they're operating out of, who they're targeting, and then ripple effect, right? Like how does that impact you even if you're not, again, in the direct purview, if you will, of or focus of an adversary, right? There's going to be some type of indirect impact as well. So I think, again, knowing the adversary is kind of the bigger theme here, but I think also the collaboration between law enforcement and private sector is only increasing, and I think we're seeing some pretty big success, and that's what this operation highlights for us. So,
yeah, and some of the big takeaways, I think we're seeing law enforcement continue to evolve. They've increased multinational cooperation, so these large things like Kronos and Endgame are exemplary of that, having multiple organizations around the globe participating in that. Having this dual enforcement strategy of going after the technical infrastructure, as I described, but also going after and getting sanctions and actual arrests. Because, and I know Sean Henry would certainly probably be pounding the desk here talking about this, is you got to take these players off the field, because if they're still out there, they're going to keep doing bad. So you have to have the dual path of actually putting bracelets on these bad guys and disrupting their infrastructure. And the more you can keep that pressure on, the more they're having to move and react. And so you want to kind of put them on their back heels. And then having that be public facing, right? Having more visibility to it, I think helps to create awareness. And also, that can result in people trying to go to the good side that are maybe doing some bad stuff. So that public sector stuff, or public facing stuff, I should say, helps drive these operations forward. And then the other thing that we're seeing, and I think is the right path and we'll continue to see, is the focus on disrupting the ecosystem and not individual things. So Lockbit's a good example of one problem, but if you look at all of the things that enabled Lockbit to get where it was as the ecosystem, and you start disrupting that ecosystem continuously, then you're going to have that pressure really ramped up, and that's the ideal state right now. And that could change, right? As adversaries continue to evolve, the tools continue to evolve, AI is continuing to play a role in this, right? Adversaries are able to move faster because of AI. But as we've talked about before, so are the defenders, right? AI can help increase the speed at which the defense is operating. And we see the adversaries constantly getting faster. The breakout time every year has gotten faster and faster. Last year, got 14 minutes faster. The average breakout time, the fastest breakout time being less than a minute. And so as the speed increases and things like AI drive that, it can, it's dual purpose. It helps the good guys as well.
It's fascinating. So you heard it here on the Adversary Universe podcast. The most impactful law enforcement disruptions combined multiple approaches such as technical takedowns and financial sanctions and arrests, and they targeted key infrastructure and personnel simultaneously to get the most impact on executing and disrupting eCrime groups and everything that we've been tracking or discussing over the past 30 or so minutes. So any final words for our listeners, Adam, and what to expect?
I think we'll continue to see that law enforcement's looking at ways to evolve this and to continue to keep the pressure on. And every time they wrap up a successful operation, I think that the best case scenario is that spawns 2 or 3 more that come out of that. We'll continue to see that pressure going up. There's an event that would have already happened, but one thing to keep an eye on is events like Cyber WarCon, which is a great event. We sponsor that, and they also have a day that focuses on eCrime as well. So big shout out to Cyber WarCon and some of the research that gets presented there.
Wait, where is that being hosted?
That's in Washington, D.C. And the other thing that everybody can expect, we've actually announced our Day Zero, which will be at Falcon. And awesome. That is a research-focused event. And so we're going to have some of our own researchers, and that's we're opening up a call for papers. Cool. So any of the researchers that are out there, anybody that's involved in disruptions or doing interesting research and wants to see that turn into a disruption, it's a good event for, we're hoping that'll be a great event to bring some of this information together and get law enforcement eyes on some of the emerging things that we're seeing from a research perspective that could be the thing that prompts the next big takedown.
Well, you heard it here. Adversary Universe podcast, law enforcement takedowns on the rise, Operation Endgame 3.0, right? 3.0?
That's right.
Very successful, and more to come on that. This is a great topic. I think we've had a lot of folks interested in hearing a lot more about how we're collaborating with law enforcement. If you are interested in hearing from some of the individuals that have worked in law enforcement or are currently in law enforcement or have some really great stories based upon their experience, Adam will work with our producers and we're going to bring some guests on. And so for our next iteration of this episode or this topic, we'll have some really great guests given some of the feedback we get from our listeners. So this is going to be exciting to get into.
Yeah, I got a list of people we could talk to, and I think from the guy that founded the NCFTA to some of the law enforcement agents that kind of spearheaded a lot of these investigations. We could certainly get some people on, but let us know if that's what you want to hear.
That's right. Let us know. Hit us up in the show notes and LinkedIn or whatever. So awesome. Thanks for today's session. This was a good one. You know,
yeah, it's
really
lots of
excited
fun.
about it. Yeah, lots of fun. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Adversary Universe podcast. See you later.
And one public service announcement,
Oh.
as we mentioned in the Global Threat Report every year, we tend to see in the back end of the year, particularly around now, an uptick in eCrime activities.
That's
so
a good point.
stay safe out there, everybody, because between Thanksgiving and New
holidays,
Year's,
that's
effectively,
right.
we tend to see a pretty big uptick in threat actor activity on the eCrime side. So
That's right.
stay safe out there, and
that's right. Stay safe. Yeah, we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to CrowdStrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.